Harlem, August 1920. The summer heat is pressing down on Lenox Avenue like a physical weight. But on this particular day, something is cutting through that heat. Something that has never happened before in American history and has not been fully repeated since. 2,000 people are marching. Not shuffling, not protesting with signs and songs. Marching in military formation, in pressed uniforms, in pristine white nurses' robes, behind a marching band playing music that sounds less like a parade and more like a declaration. The African Legion moves in crisp, disciplined columns. Black men who had fought in the trenches of World War I, who had bled for a democracy that didn't acknowledge their humanity, now marching in service of something that did. The Black Cross nurses, trained in healthcare and first aid, move in white uniforms that mirror the Red Cross, because if white institutions would not serve black people would build their own. Motor Corps, flag bearers, delegations from 22 countries. And at the center of it all, one man, dressed like an African general, because that is what he was. Not a general of armies, but of something more powerful. Of minds, of dignity, of a vision so large that the most powerful government on earth would spend years and enormous resources trying to destroy it. His name was Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and 6 years before this moment, he had arrived in America with almost nothing in his pockets, and an idea that nearly everyone told him was impossible. The idea that black people could build their own economic empire, their own institutions, their own nation within a nation, that they did not need to wait for white America to grant them dignity. That dignity was theirs to claim. He didn't just believe it. He built it. 700 branches across 38 states. A newspaper reaching hundreds of thousands of readers across 3 continents. Ships, factories, businesses. The largest mass movement in African American history, assembled in less than a decade by a printer's apprentice from Jamaica, who had arrived in New York with almost nothing. And powerful people, very powerful people, wanted him gone. This is the story of how Marcus Garvey built an empire, and why the most powerful nation on earth was determined to bring it down. Before we go any further, I need to tell you why this story is on Hidden Black Files. Because Marcus Garvey is one of those names that gets mentioned in passing, a paragraph in a textbook, a brief reference in a documentary, without anyone ever fully explaining what he actually built, what it meant, or why the United States government dedicated significant resources to destroying him. I started Hidden Black Files because I grew up learning fragments of black history, carefully selected pieces that gave me just enough to feel educated, without giving me the full picture. The deeper I researched, the more I understood that the omissions were not accidental. Marcus Garvey's story is not an omission. It is a deliberate erasure. Because his story answers a question that certain institutions do not want answered. What happens when black people stop asking for a seat at the table and build their own table instead? The answer, as you're about to hear, is that the government sends the FBI. Hidden Black Files exists to tell you what they left out. If that mission matters to you, subscribe right now, hit the bell, and help this channel reach the people who were never taught the full story of Marcus Garvey. Now, let's go back to where it all began. St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica, 1887. Marcus Mosiah Garvey was born into a world where the shadows of slavery had not fully lifted, where they had simply changed shape. His father was a stonemason, a hard man, a proud man, known throughout St. Ann's Bay for something that was genuinely unusual, a private library. In colonial Jamaica, where the British educational system was designed to produce servants and laborers rather than thinkers, a black man with a private library was not just unusual. It was an act of quiet defiance. His mother worked as a domestic servant and farmer. Like most black women in Jamaica at the time, her labor made the colonial economy function, while the colonial economy made sure she never accumulated anything from it. By age 14, Marcus was apprenticed to his godfather, Alfred Burroughs, a master printer in St. Ann's Bay. This was not just a trade. It was an education in something that would define Marcus's entire life, the relationship between words and power. In Burroughs's print shop, young Marcus learned to set type, operate presses, manage deadlines, and, most crucially, understand how words, arranged correctly, could move people to action. How a printed page could carry an idea from one person to 1,000. How the press was not just a machine but a weapon, if you understood what to do with it. He was learning the tools of his future, without knowing yet what he would build with them. Jamaica was about to teach him his first serious lesson about power. The British Empire controlled Jamaica with the complete, unsentimental efficiency of a system that had been optimized over generations. It was not cruel because the people running it were uniquely evil. It was cruel because it was designed, deliberately, structurally, to extract maximum value from black labor while returning minimum compensation to black people. White colonizers lived in mansions on hills. Black workers reported to plantations and kitchens and construction sites for wages that kept them alive but never allowed them to accumulate anything. The message embedded in every aspect of daily life was identical to the message that had been delivered under slavery, with slightly different legal mechanisms. Know your place. Marcus saw this clearly, and seeing clearly is where trouble begins. In 1907, he became involved in labor politics in Kingston. He helped organize a printers' strike, workers demanding wages that reflected the actual value of their labor. The strike failed, but failure, properly understood, is education. And what Marcus learned from this failure was more important than any victory could have taught him. The system was not accidentally unfair. It was designed to be unfair. Reform within the system was not sufficient, because the system's purpose was the condition he was trying to reform. That realization, that the problem was structural, not incidental, would become the foundation of everything Marcus Garvey would later build. He left Jamaica in 1910, not in defeat, in investigation. If the problem was global, if colonialism was a worldwide system operating by the same logic everywhere it existed, then understanding it required seeing it from multiple angles. Marcus was going to see it firsthand. Costa Rica first. The United Fruit Company was operating banana plantations across Central America, with a scale and sophistication that made it less like a corporation and more like a colonial government. It owned the farms. It owned the railroads, connecting those farms to the ports. It owned the ports. It had the political connections to topple governments that didn't cooperate with its interests. And on those plantations, Marcus saw something that stopped him cold. Black and Caribbean workers, living in company shacks, buying food from company stores at company-set prices, earning wages so deliberately calibrated that their debt to the company always exceeded what they earned, so that escape was mathematically impossible. Worked until they broke, then discarded and replaced. There were no chains. There were no whips, at least not formally. But the result was identical to what chains and whips had produced. People trapped. People powerless. People whose labor enriched a system that would never allow them to benefit from it. Marcus was looking at slavery with a different name, and he understood that this was not a local condition. This was how the system operated everywhere it went. 1912, London, the heart of the empire. The city whose wealth had been assembled from every colony it controlled: Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, India. The grand buildings and manicured parks of London were built with gold and diamonds and cotton and rubber stripped from people who saw almost none of the profit. Marcus arrived not as a student or a tourist, but as a working man, taking whatever jobs he could find to survive, including work at the African Times and Orient Review, a newspaper focused on colonial politics and the African diaspora. The pay was minimal. The education was priceless. After his shifts, Marcus spent hours in London's public reading rooms. Without formal university training, he made the city's libraries his classroom, devouring books on history, economics, political philosophy, and the mechanics of colonial power. He was trying to understand the machine from the inside out. Through his work at the newspaper, he met African students and activists from across the empire, men who were studying at institutions like Birkbeck College while their home countries were being systematically looted. Their conversations opened his eyes to a pattern that repeated itself everywhere he looked. Whether it was fruit companies in Costa Rica, canal builders in Panama, or colonial officers in London, the system was always the same. Black people and colonized people provided the labor, the resources, the raw material of wealth, while the wealth itself flowed upward and outward, away from them and toward Europe. And then, in one of London's reading rooms, he found a book that changed the direction of his life. The book was Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington. Washington was the most famous black leader in America at the time, a man born into slavery who had built Tuskegee Institute, a school teaching black Americans practical trades and technical skills. His message was strategic in its modesty: learn trades, demonstrate competence, build economic self-sufficiency gradually, and earn respect from white society through demonstrated value. Marcus read it in one sitting. He wrote later about the experience with words that have echoed through black history ever since. I read Up From Slavery, and then my doom, if I may so call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me. Where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, his men of big affairs? I could not find them. And then I declared, I will help to make them. Washington's message had been shaped by the specific conditions of post-Reconstruction America, the need to survive within a violently hostile system while building what could be built within its margins. Marcus respected the strategy, but his own travels had shown him something Washington's framework did not fully address. The system wasn't just hostile to black advancement in America. It was hostile to black advancement everywhere. It was a global architecture. And the response to a global architecture could not be patience and gradual accommodation. It had to be something larger, something structural, something that matched the scale of the problem. He returned to Jamaica in 1914. He had a plan. Jamaica, 1914. Marcus Garvey came home with a vision that was, by any reasonable measure, audacious to the point of seeming impossible. He was going to build an organization that would give black people everywhere, not just in Jamaica, not just in America, but across the African diaspora, the economic and political power they had been systematically denied for centuries. Not through integration, not through petition, not through asking the people who had built the system of oppression to please be somewhat less oppressive. Through independent black institution building, black businesses, black governance, black pride, a complete parallel infrastructure that would make black communities economically sovereign. He started small, very small. In a Kingston meeting hall, he gathered 13 people to form what he called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA. Their stated goal: to educate black people and help them build their own economic foundations, doing what the British colonial system was specifically designed to prevent them from doing. Jamaica was not ready. The local elite, both black and white, saw him as a troublemaker, a destabilizing force, a man whose message of racial pride and economic independence threatened the social arrangements on which their comfort depended. After a year of struggle, minimal growth, and persistent resistance from the people he had hoped would be his allies, Marcus made a decision. He was going to Harlem, New York City. 1916. Harlem was in the middle of a transformation that would reshape black American culture permanently. The Great Migration was underway. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans were leaving the Jim Crow South, fleeing not just poverty, but systematic violence, legal terror, and the daily humiliation of a social system that treated them as something less than fully human. They were flooding north into cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, carrying with them the accumulated pain and resilience of generations of survival. Harlem was their capital: packed tenements, back-breaking work for inadequate wages, the familiar American arrangement of black labor generating wealth that flowed to others. But something else was happening in Harlem too, something new. Black-owned businesses were opening. Black artists and writers were finding their voices. Black political organizations were taking shape. A community was discovering its own power, tentatively, incompletely, but unmistakably. Marcus rented a small basement room and began holding meetings. His first audience, 17 people. But something happened when he spoke that had not happened in most political meetings these people had attended. Marcus Garvey did not ask them to be patient. He did not counsel moderation. He did not frame black dignity as something that white society needed to be persuaded to grant. He told them that dignity was already theirs, that the question was not whether black people deserved freedom and self-determination. That was not a question at all. The question was what they were going to build. A race without authority and power, he told his growing audiences, is a race without respect. The crowds grew. Dozens. Then hundreds. Marcus understood something that many political leaders miss. A movement needs a media infrastructure. In 1918, he launched a newspaper called Negro World. The publication decisions alone were a statement of values. While other black newspapers softened their content and avoided controversy to retain white advertisers, Negro World refused to run advertisements for skin lightening creams or hair straightening products. The industries that profited from black self-hatred, that told black people their natural appearance was something to be corrected. Negro World's message was unambiguous. Black is beautiful. Black is powerful. Black people need to build their own economic strength. The world that tells you to be ashamed of what you are is the same world that profits from your shame, and you do not have to participate in it. The paper hit a nerve that ran deep. Within months, Negro World was selling tens of thousands of copies, not just in Harlem, but across America, across the Caribbean, and into colonial Africa, where European governments recognized the danger of its message clearly enough to ban it. A newspaper being banned by colonial governments was not bad advertising. It was confirmation that the message was landing. By 1919, Marcus Garvey had built something that had not existed before, a mass black political and economic movement with a genuine multimedia infrastructure, an ideological framework, and a growing membership that crossed national and class lines. And he was just getting started. 1919. Black America. To be black in America in 1919 was to navigate a world of constant, codified, legally enforced humiliation. You could not eat at most restaurants. You could not stay at most hotels. You could not walk through most front doors. You could not vote in most of the South. You could be killed for looking at a white person the wrong way, and the killer would face no legal consequence. The Red Summer of 1919 saw white mobs attack black communities in cities across the country: Chicago, Elaine, Washington, D.C., with a frequency and intensity that made clear this was not random violence, but systematic terrorism designed to maintain racial hierarchy through fear. Into this moment of concentrated black fear and pain, Marcus Garvey walked into Liberty Hall, the UNIA's new Harlem headquarters, and made an announcement that seemed impossible. Black people were going to build their own steamship line. The major shipping companies of the era had names that reflected their identity without embarrassment: the White Star Line, the Cunard Line. Marcus's answer to them would be named without ambiguity: the Black Star Line. His reasoning was not merely symbolic, it was structural. Every piece of cotton, every pound of sugar, every banana that left black hands had to travel on white-owned ships. Black businesses were economically dependent on white shipping infrastructure, which meant black businesses were not truly independent. Real economic sovereignty required control of the supply chain. The Black Star Line was not a symbol of aspiration. It was an infrastructure project. The financial model was revolutionary in its accessibility. Shares in the Black Star Line were priced at $5 each. In today's money, approximately $75, not a negligible amount for people earning poverty wages, but not an impossible one either. And something happened that the people who dismissed Marcus as a dreamer had not anticipated. They bought. Black Pullman porters who spent their working lives serving white passengers on segregated trains bought shares. Black maids who cleaned white homes bought shares. Black factory workers, black farmers, black teachers, black ministers, people who had never owned stock in anything, who had never been invited to participate in the ownership of American economic life, stood in lines to buy $5 shares in a black-owned shipping company. Because this was not an investment in the conventional sense. This was buying a piece of freedom. Within months, the Black Star Line had raised enough capital to purchase its first ship, a vessel that Marcus renamed the SS Frederick Douglass, after the man who had spent his life arguing that black people deserved to be treated as human beings. When that ship sailed into Caribbean ports, thousands of black people crowded the docks, not to watch it arrive, to see something that had never existed. A ship owned, operated, and crewed entirely by black people, traveling routes that black entrepreneurs needed, traveled, under a black flag. It was not just a ship, it was proof. The summer of 1920, 2,000 delegates from 22 countries descended on Harlem for the first International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World. Read that again carefully. 22 countries. Delegates who had crossed oceans to be in the same room, to participate in the same process, to assert collectively what their individual circumstances had denied them individually. That black people everywhere, in America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Europe, shared a common identity, a common set of grievances, and a common claim to dignity and self-determination. Nothing like this had ever been organized before. The convention opened with the kind of ceremony that sends a message before a word is spoken. The African Legion, black veterans of World War I, men who had bled for nations that didn't acknowledge their humanity, now in the service of a movement that did, marched in military formation through the streets of Harlem. The Black Cross nurses, modeled on the Red Cross but built for a community the Red Cross didn't fully serve, moved in disciplined formation. Then Marcus unveiled something that had not existed before. A flag. Red, black, and green. The red for the blood shed by black people in their centuries of struggle. The black for the race itself. The green for the land of Africa. The origin point. The ancestral home. The continent that had been carved up and looted while the world called it civilization. Those colors did not stay in that room. They spread. Today you will find them in civil rights protests, in independence movements, in the flags of African nations. The symbolism Marcus created in 1920 is still doing work in 2024. And then came the convention's most consequential act, the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. Think of it as what it was, a black declaration of independence. Years before the United Nations would declare human rights universal, in a world where the legal and political systems of most countries explicitly did not extend full rights to black people. This document stated without qualification or apology what black people everywhere were entitled to: an end to racial discrimination, political independence for Africa, equal justice under law, the right of black people to control their own economic destiny. It was not a petition, it was not a request, it was a declaration. And it arrived at a moment when the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, was watching Marcus Garvey with increasing alarm. Not everyone in the black community was celebrating. W.E.B. Du Bois was Marcus Garvey's ideological opposite in almost every way that mattered. Harvard-educated, Northern-born, respected in white intellectual circles, Du Bois believed in integration, in the strategy of demanding full inclusion within American society, of fighting to be recognized as equal participants in the American project. As a founder and leader of the NAACP, he had built the most prominent civil rights organization in the country around exactly this vision. Du Bois called Marcus the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. Marcus called Du Bois a tool of white supremacy. Both men were intelligent. Both men were committed. Both men were responding to the same reality of black suffering, with frameworks shaped by their very different experiences and their very different assessments of what was possible. The clash between them was not a personality conflict. It was a genuine, consequential disagreement about the fundamental question of black liberation strategy. Do you work within the system, demanding inclusion and equal treatment? Or do you build outside it, creating parallel institutions that make black communities economically sovereign? That debate did not end when Marcus was deported, and Du Bois eventually joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana. It is still happening. Every time someone argues about integration versus black institution building, about representation within existing structures versus creating new ones, they are, whether they know it or not, continuing the conversation that Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois began in 1920s Harlem. J. Edgar Hoover had been watching Marcus Garvey since before the UNIA's first international convention. Hoover was the head of the Bureau of Investigation, what would become the FBI, and he had made the suppression of black political organizing one of his central preoccupations. He called it radical Negro activities. What he meant was, any black person who challenged the racial hierarchy that white America had built and intended to maintain. Marcus Garvey, with his millions of followers and his message of complete economic and political independence from white society, was the most extreme version of Hoover's nightmare. An internal memo from Hoover's office captured his frustration with characteristic directness. Unfortunately, he has not as yet violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the point of deportation. Hoover didn't have a case yet, so he built one. The Bureau created a special investigation section specifically targeting black political activity, one of the earliest versions of what would later be called COINTELPRO. They hired their first black agent specifically to infiltrate the UNIA. Marcus's mail was opened. His phones were tapped. Spies attended his meetings and reported back on every speech, every decision, every organizational development. Surveillance as a weapon, not because Marcus was planning violence, not because the UNIA was breaking laws, but because Hoover understood what Marcus was doing better than most of Marcus's opponents gave him credit for. He was showing black people that they didn't need white America's permission. That realization, at scale, was the most dangerous thing Hoover could imagine. Take a moment here and consider what was being documented in those FBI files. A black man, born in Jamaica, who had arrived in America with almost nothing, had built a movement of millions of people across 38 states and 22 countries around the idea that black people deserve dignity and economic self-determination. He had launched a newspaper that colonial governments were banning. He had put black people on ships they owned. He had convened an international congress that produced a Black Declaration of Independence. And the United States government's primary concern was, how do we stop him? Not, how do we address the conditions that made his movement necessary? Not, what does it mean that millions of black people are responding to a message of complete separation from American institutions? How do we stop him? That tells you everything you need to know about what Marcus Garvey represented. Hidden Black Files covers stories like this one, because understanding this history is not optional. If you don't understand what Marcus Garvey built and why it was destroyed, you cannot fully understand the civil rights movement that came after, the Black Power movement that followed that, or the debates about black economic independence that continue today. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files. Share this video. Help us reach the people who were never taught why J. Edgar Hoover was afraid of a newspaper editor from Jamaica. Now, back to Marcus. Because the fall was coming, and it was engineered. The summer of 1922, Marcus Garvey was at the height of his power. Millions of followers, businesses across the country, a shipping line, a newspaper, the largest black mass movement in history. And then he made a decision that would haunt his legacy forever. He traveled to Atlanta to meet with Edward Young Clark, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan. To understand this decision, you have to understand Marcus's thinking, even if you ultimately reject it as catastrophically wrong. The Klan preached racial separation. Marcus preached black self-reliance and the development of separate black institutions. In his mind, in a reasoning process that his critics then and now have found incomprehensible, he saw a potential basis for agreement. Both believed the races should develop separately. He was wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong, about what that meeting represented and what it would do to the movement he had built. The backlash was immediate. Black newspapers that had supported him turned. Followers who had defended his most controversial positions could not find language to defend this one. The moral authority that his movement required evaporated in the heat of the photograph of a black leader shaking hands with the Klan. J. Edgar Hoover saw his opening. The reputation damage was done. Now Hoover needed something that looked like legitimate law enforcement rather than political persecution. He found it in the mail. Federal mail fraud law made it a crime to use the U.S. postal system as part of any deceptive scheme. The Black Star Line was struggling, significantly so. Ships had been damaged, mismanaged, and undermined by a combination of genuine operational difficulties, officers who were taking bribes, and, though this would take years to fully document, active government interference with the company's operations. Every promotional letter Marcus sent about the company, every stock certificate mailed to investors, every piece of correspondence that traveled through the postal system while the Black Star Line was in financial difficulty, all of it could now be framed as mail fraud. It did not matter that Marcus genuinely believed the company could be turned around. It did not matter that the government's own agents had helped create the conditions that were destroying it. It did not matter that some of his officers were working against him from the inside. What mattered was that he had used the mail, while the company was in trouble. That was the hook. The key piece of evidence Hoover's prosecutors presented at the 1923 trial. A single empty envelope sent to one investor, with nothing inside it. An empty envelope. That was the foundation of the federal case against the man who had built the largest black mass movement in American history. The all-white jury delivered its verdict quickly. 5 years in Atlanta, federal penitentiary. Hoover had discovered something that would be used against black leaders for decades to come. A template that would be refined and deployed against Malcolm X, against Martin Luther King Jr., against Fred Hampton, against the Black Panther Party. You do not charge a political threat with politics. You find a technical violation, tax issues, mail fraud, licensing problems, anything, and you use the machinery of law enforcement to remove the person from the equation while appearing to simply enforce the law. The content of Marcus's message was never on trial. His challenge to the racial hierarchy was never formally prosecuted. An empty envelope got him 5 years. In 1927, President Calvin Coolidge commuted his sentence but ordered him deported to Jamaica. Marcus Garvey would never set foot in the United States again. The UNIA did not survive the loss of its leader. Not intact. Membership declined. The businesses closed one by one. The shipping line, the dream of black economic infrastructure that had put ships in Caribbean harbors and crowds on the docks, was gone. The great apparatus Marcus had assembled over a decade collapsed within years of his deportation, and the people who had wanted him gone congratulated themselves on a successful operation. But they had made a fundamental error in their assessment of what they had destroyed. They had destroyed the organization. They had not destroyed the idea. The seeds Marcus planted did not require him to be present to grow. Malcolm X knew this. He said it directly. Every time you see another nation on the African continent become independent, you know that Marcus Garvey is alive. Malcolm knew from personal experience. His father, Earl Little, was a UNIA organizer who had preached Marcus's message of black pride and self-reliance to his children. The ideas that shaped Malcolm X's worldview were rooted, at least in part, in what his father had absorbed from Marcus Garvey. The Nation of Islam, which would shape American black politics significantly through the mid-20th century, adopted Marcus's message of black economic independence and racial pride as central to its identity. When they built their own businesses and preached self-reliance, they were working from Marcus's blueprint. In Jamaica, the Rastafari movement emerged from the spiritual dimensions of Marcus's thought, his teachings about African redemption and black identity becoming the foundation of a religious tradition that would spread globally. And in Africa itself, on the continent Marcus had declared must be free, his influence was most visible and most lasting. Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to become the first independent black African nation in 1957, explicitly and publicly credited Marcus Garvey's teachings as foundational to his vision of African liberation. When Ghana designed its first national shipping line after independence, they named it the Black Star Line, a direct, deliberate homage to the company that had been destroyed 30 years earlier in a New York courtroom. Ghana's national flag contains a black star at its center. Marcus Garvey's flag, red, black, and green, became the colors of African liberation. You will find echoes of those colors in the flags and symbols of independence movements across the continent. The symbolism he created in 1920 was adopted by people who were fighting for freedom in the 1950s and 1960s, 2 decades after his death. In America, every generation of black political thought that followed Marcus Garvey has had to engage with him, either building on his framework or explicitly rejecting it. The civil rights leaders of the 1960s who talked about black capitalism were working in his tradition. The Black Power movement's emphasis on pride, self-determination, and independent black institutions was Garvey recontextualized for a new generation. The ongoing conversation about supporting black-owned businesses, about building black economic infrastructure, about the limits of integration as a liberation strategy, all of it traces back, in one way or another, to a printer's apprentice from St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica. Marcus Garvey died in London in 1940. He was 52 years old. He was far from America. He was far from the movement he had built. He had spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, writing, organizing at a smaller scale, watching from a distance as the seeds he had planted grew into things he had not fully anticipated. He never fully recovered the organizational power he had built in the 1920s. The FBI operation had worked, in that narrow sense. The UNIA was not rebuilt. The Black Star Line was not relaunched. The specific institutions were not restored. But consider what J. Edgar Hoover actually achieved. He destroyed an organization. He deported a man. He removed one person from one country. And Marcus Garvey's influence is still visible in the flags of African nations, in the philosophy of movements that formed decades after his death, in the ongoing debate about black economic independence that is as alive in 2024 as it was in 1920. You cannot deport an idea. You cannot imprison a vision that has already been absorbed by millions of people across 3 continents. You cannot mail fraud your way to the end of a movement that has become larger than any single organization. Hoover got Marcus Garvey out of America. He could not get Marcus Garvey out of history. Go back to Harlem. August 1920, 2,000 delegates on Lenox Avenue. The African Legion in pressed uniforms. The Black Cross nurses in white. Red, black, and green flags moving in the August heat. A marching band. 22 countries represented. The largest black gathering in American history up to that point. And at the center of it, a man who had arrived in this country with almost nothing, who had been told his idea was impossible, who had been surveilled and infiltrated and prosecuted and deported, who had built it anyway. Marcus Garvey said something toward the end of his life that has stayed in black political consciousness ever since. Look for me in the whirlwind. He was right. You can find him in Ghana's Black Star, in the colors on African flags, in the Rastafari faith that spread his vision of African redemption globally, in Malcolm X's framework, in the Nation of Islam's economic philosophy, in every organization that has argued for black self-determination rather than integration, in every black-owned business launched by someone who believed that economic independence was part of what freedom means. You can find him in the ongoing argument, still unresolved, still consequential, about whether the path to black liberation runs through American institutions or around them. The government broke his organization. They destroyed his businesses. They prosecuted him on the evidence of an empty envelope. They deported him and told themselves the problem was solved. But the printer's apprentice from Jamaica had changed something that could not be changed back. He had shown black people everywhere that they did not have to ask for dignity. They could stand up and simply claim it. That idea, that specific, powerful, threatening idea, was the one thing J. Edgar Hoover never managed to arrest. And it is still free. Look for it in the whirlwind. It's still there. If this story moved you, if Marcus Garvey's name means something different to you now than it did 35 minutes ago, that is exactly what Hidden Black Files is here for. I built this channel because I grew up learning history in fragments, because the full story of what black people built and what was done to destroy it was never in my textbooks, because I came to understand that the silence wasn't accidental, that stories like Marcus Garvey's are left out not because they're unimportant, but because they're too important, too threatening to a certain version of history that certain people need you to believe. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files. Share this video. Leave a comment. Tell us what you knew about Marcus Garvey before today and what this changed. Because if we don't tell these stories, they disappear. And the people who lived them disappear with them. Hidden Black Files exists, so that never happens.